Hi, everyone. This is the first advisor talk with Michelle Mope Andersson. Michelle Mope Andersson grew up in California and did her master's degree in spirituality and counseling at Loyola University, Chicago, and doctorates focusing on reconciliation in the arts. She's a counselor and a facilitator and has worked as a wellness and stress counselor in the United Nations Development Program in North Korea. She's lived and worked in 6 countries alongside her husband, Ambassador Carl Olaf Andersson. Since 2007, she's been living and working in Beijing, China. Michelle also promotes art exhibitions and music exhibitions with the aim of honoring our fragility and understanding and reconciling relationships, and enabling stories through art, with particular attention to the sacred arts. In times of crisis and conflict, she provides inspiration and support for creative individuals based on their life experiences and aspirations. Thanks so much for being here, Michelle.
Thank you.
So,
happy to be with you.
I want to get started just by talking a little bit about your background and kind of the two seemingly maybe different or distant areas of passion for you, counseling on one side and arts on the other. Can you tell me a little bit about these two passions and maybe how they've connected in your life and maybe even why they were connected?
Absolutely. So as you say, I'm very interested in the way that we use art as a means of healing by telling our own sacred stories through the arts. We tend to seek places where we can find mirrors of our own stories, and we do this through the arts, and we often do this in exhibition spaces, in museums and at galleries and in concerts as well. In my work, I love helping people to discover their deepest desires through their spiritual life and to discover how to manifest those desires in their creative work.
So we're in this global crisis, and I think in the introduction I mentioned how in crises you kind of help to bring out inspiration and help to encourage not only artists but other people and kind of how they can approach those crises. But can you first kind of talk a little bit about like what's happening when we're facing these kind of crises internally, like what's happening as people in our minds?
When we're thrown into a crisis, our usual routines and our patterns are sort of suspended and our boundaries become softer. We start to realize our interdependence and our need for one another. And in spirituality, we also call this time liminal time or liminal space, when it really feels like nothing is happening and that there's nothing we can do. But in fact, in reality, we're sort of on the edge, on the frontier of something very new coming into our lives.
I mean, it's a recurring theme, and I guess crisis and crises are part of the human experience and being humans, and we're faced with different crises like every day, and especially now with this kind of global pandemic. What do you think art says as ourselves being part of a larger history or kind of a larger part of collective humanity?
Art speaks volumes. It reminds us of our resilience, also our resistance, and even our rebellion. We actually can realize that this is not uncharted territory when we kind of look back into history. We can look back at the bubonic plague, and we see representations of that in art all over Italy. For example, there are these wonderful images of the Dance of Death portraits in Northern Europe that were painted by Franciscans in the 1500s. And this particular image comes from Tallinn, Estonia in the 15th century. And death is personified playing bagpipes and dancing with the emperor and with nobles and church officials alike, reminding us that life is short, reminding us of the brevity of life and make good use of your time. And I think another really interesting image is Ingmar Bergman's movie, The Seventh Seal. And in that classic film, there we see Max von Sydow playing chess with the devil on a beach under the midnight sun. And that medieval scene actually continues to relive itself. If you walk around the streets of Stockholm, people are distancing, but there are certainly places where people gather as well in bars. And it's an expression of freedom and an expression of rebellion as well. And there does need to be that dialectic that we have this freedom and we have to take responsibility for how we use it, that doesn't always guarantee that it'll be well used.
You've been kind of talking about is how like art reflects that constant crisis that we as humans experience, and just the human experience is full of crises, whether it be internal, external, like natural, man-made. There's crises all around us, and I think, like you were mentioning, we keep seeing this repeated through art, and not just like love or life, but crisis is something that we see repeated throughout art, and art represents that crisis. How can you talk a little bit about like how does art help us to, or how does art act as a vehicle to express our emotions throughout these crises, or maybe even express emotions that we don't know how to otherwise in these crises?
One of the best examples comes from the Surrealist movement. You know, it grew out of the Spanish flu and the First World War, and in the face of fascism, in fact. And I think it's important to remember that it was Guillaume Apollinaire, and he was listening to the music of Erik Satie when he coined the phrase surrealist. And I think there you're showing Apollinaire's notes on the experience of surrealism. And then we move from that into the music of Erik Satie. Satie was at the time writing what he called furniture music. So that is called furniture music, and it's background music which plays while something much larger is actually taking place on the scene. And of course, that's real life. The imagery and the music kind of reflect a shattered landscape, very much like today. Fragments of memory from the unconscious, a landscape of art amid a fractured world, something happening in the background, in the music, and then something playing itself out on the larger stage of real life. And I think it's also interesting to consider how the work of Max Ernst, which I think you also have an example of for us, grew out of the same experience of the horrors of World War I. So this painting that we're looking at is called The Angel of the Hearth and Home, and the whole title was just meant to confuse or jar the observer. It's a title which should, but doesn't resonate with what is. So art and music kind of became a coping device, and it was used then, and we use it today to help to carry us through very difficult times, then the First World War and the Spanish flu. And we're using art and music again to serve humanity in the same way, to explain a story. I think another piece of art that we can look at might be Giorgio de Chirico. He had this idea about the perfect metaphysical city. And here we see the muses in this metaphysical city. And they're in a dialogue with the unknown. I think this imagery really reflects our experience of the lockdown today in so many places, these empty, eerie, empty streets, and people having a dialogue with themselves or with what they don't understand, trying to make sense, trying to make reason. And you know, Sylvia Plath writes a monumental poem about this image of the muses, where she brings her own experience of abandonment intimately into the painting. She goes into an artistic dialogue with the subjects in the painting, and even with the artist himself. And Plath, in her writing, she plays off of the shadows that we see behind these muses. And those are, of course, her own shadows. When we look at those shadows, at least when I see those shadows, I'm chilled, I become cold. And I see this looming darkness and fear of the aboding. And there's so much anxiety in this painting, which is so relevant for so many people today.
I'm kind of struck by as you kind of describe Sylvia Plath and all of these artists kind of responding to these terrible events like the bubonic plague, the Spanish flu, the World War I, World War II. and the crises that they experienced internally as a society. It's really interesting that, I mean, and you can see, like, as you mentioned, art does become this vehicle for expression, and vehicle for expressing the ideas of fear, of unknown, of crisis that maybe we couldn't write down. And I think that's, for us as a program, that's something we definitely want to do, is be able to express those emotions. But I think going to kind of the theme of this talk, and looking even beyond the expression of that, you also say that art is a way that we can start to overcome these crises, maybe internal crises or external crises, that it starts to become like a form of reconciliation. What does that mean to you, or how do you see art in the lens of reconciliation, beyond kind of expression of that emotion, but how does it start to act as a reconciliation agent?
Art, in a very beautiful way, allows us to honor and reconcile our broken places, our wounds, our woundedness as a humanity. People are internally shattered right now. We know that our environment is fragile, and we talk a lot about that. But I think that we're only beginning to realize how fragile we as people, as a humanity, are, and what role we play in relation to others as we become cut off from one another around the world. Through art, we tell our stories, and we reconcile the discordances, and we ennoble these broken places with meaning through beauty. And that's the essence of the desire to be generative and to create something in the process of art.
That's interesting. I think we're going to get to that idea of the generative power of art. And I'm excited to talk about that. But before we get into that, I want to talk about this idea of the unknown. And you brought it up earlier as well, that this is a type of fear. Many of us were dealing with this kind of fear of the virus, the physical health risk that we're facing, and maybe for ourselves, maybe for others. But I think in a more general sense, we're dealing with a wider set of issues that has been caused by the virus, which are fears of the unknown, triggered in places like the economy, political instability, media. I think of race in America over the events of the last few days, and we were talking to some artists over the past week, and this idea that, like, the virus, it impacts our health, but it's magnifying the other issues and the other fears or insecurities. So yeah, how do you think that art can help us to overcome that kind of fear of the unknown, or fear in general?
Fear is very often, in theology as well, a manifestation of evil. And that is, fear is what drives out our creativity. Our creative forces become our way of fighting back against fear. It allows us to embrace the unknown, to welcome the unknown as a place of possibility. But it's interesting that the virus actually snuffs out our breath. Our life-giving energy. And if we go back to the Greek and the Hebrew idea of breath giving us life, breath as spirit, it's interesting to note that there's a word shared both in medicine and theology, and that word is pneumatology. Think of the word pneumonia. Pneumatology, the study of both breath in medicine and spirit, Holy Spirit, in theology. And that is what gives us life. That's what inspires art and culture and all that's generative. And so what does this pandemic do? It attacks our culture. It attacks everything that is alive within us and snuffs out our creativity and our breath. I also think that there's really an important connection between freedom and creativity and hope. Because when our freedom is threatened, then we really feel that our creativity is going to be compromised. But if there's hope, we can maintain hope. we realize that hope is something that can never be taken away from us. And in fact, it's hope itself that helps in that ennobling process of the creation of beauty. Art overcomes fear because it's generative. It connects us through time, through history. And one thing I learned living in North Korea is that we cannot live forever in fear. Where you see people who have experienced war anywhere in the world, you can fear air raid sirens and blackouts for a limited amount of time, and then its novelty sort of wears off. And that seems to be what's also sort of happening with the lockdowns. And we can only stay in fight or flight mode for a limited amount of time. The panic wears off, and we come to appreciate, again, our fragility. And we come to an understanding that there's something larger than ourselves that will help us to get through all of this. And it's not going to be fear.
You talked about this idea of like art being generative and almost art being this kind of like positive force that can help us to overcome these fears. And I think about this kind of global crisis where we're this phrase, like the new normal, is what people keep talking about. Like, what's the new normal going to be like? And I find it interesting that what you were just talking about is how art plays a part in that new normal. That to get to that new normal, or to get to somewhere more stable, we have to start creating, and then that creative act, or the act of creation, or being a part of creating something, actually helps us to overcome things that the crisis that we're dealing with, or almost fight back against those things. Can you talk a little bit more about like that creator? I mean, we're talking to a group of artists and creative people, and I think everyone has creativity in themselves and expresses it some way. Can you talk about that idea of the creative force within each of us, or the creator within each of us, and how does that realization that we are creators, and also observing other things that have been created, how does that help us to overcome these crises?
Yeah, it's the continual process, the generative process. I think it does two things for us. First of all, it makes us realize that we're not forgotten. We encounter something deep within ourselves, and we find it affirmed in the work of others. And that's why this collaborative effort that you are making with the Co-Residency project is so important. We hear it time and again beyond words in music. We see it represented, again, beyond words in art. I hope that we'll, of course, be seeing it in film as well. And so when we look at the created object or listen to a piece of music, it becomes kind of like looking in a mirror, and we're affirmed in our existence. And then the other thing that I think art does that is so important, especially now, is that art refreshes. So when the world becomes tired and utterly fatigued by all of the news and the numbers, and we all decide this is enough, I want to live, and I want to live fully in whatever time I have, we find that affirmed in the creative process. So art breathes life into us. It becomes that breath. It becomes that spirit, a source of spirit for all of us. We see something magnificent, and what do we do when we see something that we think is really beautiful?
Yes.
We gasp, we sigh, exactly. So again, going back to the idea of filling ourselves with breath, with spirit, the experience of art is deeply spiritual.
What else do you think art allows us to do as artists? You talked about like art being refreshing, or art breathing life into work, maybe our work, and maybe society at large. And I think you talked about freedom as well. this idea of hope and freedom, what else can art do kind of internally to empower us to keep creating and also like to keep living?
Yeah, well, actually, art allows us to travel, at least vicariously, when we can't go anywhere, and I think we're all feeling that right now. So it allows us to travel through time and place, sort of inward and outward, and also to follow the journey and the longings of our heart. So we become both recipients and participants in a journey, a spiritual journey, when we engage in the creative process, and also when we are the recipient, sharing in the gift of the artist. So it sort of unbinds us and unblocks the flow in our mind, in our spirit. And when we regain flow, we can reestablish our connectedness with people around us, no matter where they are, no matter where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you say is so important. I think just thinking about, and one of the motivations to start this program is not just to create in silos, but also to create in community or to create through connection. And that's why we wanted to bring different people from different backgrounds and different places and different mediums together to kind of instantiate that creative process, and allow us, maybe we're not able to be in the studio together, or maybe we're not able to go to an exhibition together, but maybe through this kind of platform we're also able to connect or travel, to connect with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I want to kind of wrap up just by going back to maybe some of your applied work in counseling and wellness. Can you share maybe some practical tips, like what are some things we could do as we create? And I think talking about all of this from an intellectual level, all the things that, or all the ways that art can be a part of crises or act in crises. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, and sometimes it's hard to have the motivation to keep creating and keep moving forward. What are some like practical things that we could do, or maybe practical tips that we could integrate into our practice to continue creating amid this crisis?
I think one of the most practical and simple, maybe not so simple, tips is to be aware of our breathing, to
Mm-hmm.
be aware of the gift of breath and how that connects us with everyone around us, how we take in goodness, we take in life, and to breathe deeply into the core of our beings, into our bellies, to fill ourselves with good things, and to really be aware of what we take in. Breath is the beginning, but of course, everything, images and news and foods, what we take in, and then what we do with that, and what we put out, what we share and process, because that is very much a gift of spirit, of self, and of sharing, and of hope.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, this has been a really great conversation. Thanks so much, Michelle, for being with us and just sharing some of your thoughts of how art can play a part in these crises and how that connects to us as creators and artists, but also how it can reflect in the wider community, in the wider world. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.